Hi, this is Tim with Morial TV and Morial Radio, here live with James Jacob Prash via Skype in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus. Speaking to you this week from Argentina, Buenos Aires. And it's the beginning of spring here. Of course, it's the beginning of autumn in Britain, America, etc. But here in Australia, and to our viewers in South Africa and New Zealand, it's the beginning of spring. Wonderful time to be here. In any event, let's go to the Lord in prayer because the times in which we live in are not so good. We need to be praying seriously about a number of issues. One of which, this week in prophecy, is obviously the hurricanes, both the devastation of much of Houston and also the hurricane now sweeping through the Caribbean, heading towards Florida very rapidly as we speak. These are major causes of concern, and we certainly urge prayer that the Lord will stay these things in His grace. But we have to understand His hand is in control. Speaking today as well, we've had a major earthquake in Mexico, 8.2 on the Richter scale, in an area of Mexico where the construction is not very good or very solid. Certainly not many earthquake-proof buildings, and I'm still waiting for reports of the amount of devastation, but it does not sound good. 8.2 is quite high on the Richter scale. So from meteorology to seismology, we are seeing a week of natural disasters. We're also seeing a week of wars and rumors of wars. Now, things like this have happened before, and they've even happened before in Constellation. But this time it is different than other times in history for a number of reasons. One of which, of course, is the nuclear factor. We have to remember something, that long before Einstein, Albert Einstein and his theory of relativity, and long before Mr. Teller or Mr. Oppenheimer. A fisherman from Galilee understood the possibility of thermonuclear destruction when we read the original Greek text of 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. This is what it would actually say in Greek. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the stoichia, the elements, will be destroyed with intense heat, or in Greek, dissolved with fire, and the earth and the works that are upon it will be burned up. Before Albert Einstein, before the 20th century, nobody understood the divisibility of an atom into subatomic particles and the potential to get explosive energy from it. 238, uranium-238 was unknown, plutonium was unknown, fissionable material was unknown, enrichment was unknown. None of these technologies existed. The atomic numbers of the elements that would be most prone to critical mass was unknown. Yet 2,000 years ago, a fisherman from Galilee stated, not only is it possible to dissolve a stoichia, an element. Stoichia is the Greek word for element, like stoichiometry, the study of the periodic chart, with atomic number, gram atomic weight, and things like that. You'll see it in a high school textbook or whatever. In any event, 2,000 years ago, a fisherman from Galilee said it is possible to destroy an element with heat, destroy something on the elemental level, to dissolve an atom and get explosive energy from it, and in quantities significant enough to destroy the earth. That is the first thing that makes this time different than the other times where there's been wars and rumors of wars. You now have a maniac in North Korea who's quite willing to sell those weapons to other maniacs in countries such as Iran, with whom he's been in bed for some time. The rocket technology, the delivery systems, the ICBMs that he's trying to develop, much of that technology is coming from China, hypocritically. They're helping him. The components are made in China, certainly many of them. So there's a delivery system, but there's also nuclear warheads. Wars and rumors of wars, but this time we're talking about a certain kind of atomic weapon of mass destruction. Secondly, the Jews are back in Israel and are at the epicenter of world events. That has not happened at other times when there was wars and rumors of wars. Looking at the reality of what's happening meteorologically and transpiring in the sphere of seismology, again, these things have certainly happened before and happened in concert with each other. This is without question. But it is also without question the frequency and the levels of devastation they are causing are nearly without precedent. It would only be periodically that you'd have a hurricane like Hurricane Andrew or Katrina. Hurricanes of that magnitude are becoming a lot more common. Seismologically, earthquakes above 8 or above 7.5 on the Richter scale are becoming a lot more common. They've always happened, but they're a lot more common now. We are beginning to see things. It's interesting that the book of Revelation says one of the judgments that's going to happen are beasts of the earth. Beasts of the earth. As urbanization has destroyed the habitats of these species, they've lost their natural fear of man. Britain is overrun with disease-spreading foxes, and the greenies and animal rights activists are against fox hunting.
Keep the ban, left, right. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Call the Tories. Keep the ban. Call the Tories. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. There's no excuse for animals. excuse. It's not tradition. It's violence. It's not affection. Keep the ban. Affection. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban. Keep the ban.
Since the introduction of the Hunting Act, for example, fox populations are PBS today, and you'll hear from one more later. And no such list has been...
At the end of the day, you know, what sort of person thinks it's okay to chase something for miles in fear of its life and it ends up getting ripped to pieces? How is that sport?
I think it's abhorrent. It's barbaric. It's not a sport. There's no way that we can call this a sport when you've got 30 riders and a pack of hounds hounding a small animal to death and tearing it to pieces. Where is the sport in that?
We're here because Theresa May has suggested that she would like to drop the current ban in fox hunting, and we want to make it clear to her that we will not take this and it will never happen as far as I'm concerned.
And we really want to make sure that they know that it's unacceptable, that it's not just foxes, it's innocent beings, and we shouldn't call them pests and kill them for pleasure. It doesn't make any sense. Just leave foxes alone.
Compounding the problem where disease is being spread by rats who pilfer garbage. It's happening. In Australia, kangaroos are all over the place. They've had a population explosion. Kangaroos, the big reds, can be quite dangerous to humans if they're encountered. They're not benign creatures if you encounter them. And if there's more and more of them, you're going to see more and more episodes of confrontation. So in Britain, it's foxes. In Australia, it's kangaroos. But in the United States, it is deer and reindeer. They will attack people during their mating season, or if you get between them and a calf, they will attack humans. Bears, even in the outer suburbs of New York City, there have been incidents of bears coming into people's front yards, backyard gardens, and so forth. You can only wonder if these things are what the Book of Revelation spoke of. It's also interesting to know there's been an increase in shark attacks. Now, before my health gave way, before I developed edema, I was a professionally qualified scuba diver. I did that for a hobby sometimes. I can't do it anymore for health reasons. But I encountered sharks, and the only sharks I was ever afraid of was when I scuba dived in Australia once at the Great Barrier. You had to be careful of great whites. But otherwise, I was not afraid of sharks. I would see sharks. They didn't bother you. They kept away from you. Now, sharks will attack people on the surface with things like surfboards because they can mistake it for a seal or something like this in certain environments, generally avoiding humans. But shark attacks are increasing. Now, when you add to this biogenetic engineering, and you are putting genetic properties from other species into an animal that causes it to become more intelligent but also more aggressive. This has been done in canine breeding. Now, some canine breeding using things like golden retrievers and Labrador retrievers was used quite well to develop and breed superior seeing eye dogs to help blind people. The technology is not wrong. The science in itself is not wrong. It can be used for good. But as we've said many times, the world is in the power of the wicked one. Anything that fallen man can use for evil, he will. You can use radioactive technology, radioactivity, for isotope therapy to treat cancer patients, targeted radiotherapy against cancerous tissues to combat metastatic expansion of a cancer. It can be used for good, but it will be used for evil. Biogenetic engineering is the same. we are seeing things beginning to happen on a magnitude that is without historical precedence. We are seeing it in nature. We are seeing it meteorologically. We are seeing it seismologically. But we are also seeing the man-made element mixing the seed, as we're warned about and warned against in Genesis. And we are seeing wars and rumors of wars on a nuclear scale, with despots desperate to hang on to power and willing to do anything in order to hang on to the power. Very dangerous situation, with Israel at the center of much of it. Let us move on. This is not to scaremonger. It is simply to echo the words of Jesus. We'll hear of wars and rumors of wars, but the end is not yet. There will be famines and earthquakes in diverse places, but these things are the beginning of birth pangs. We are coming into that phase known as the beginning of birth pangs. At some point, somebody is going to make a treaty in the Middle East that will be different than Oslo I, Oslo II, Camp David. There'll be another treaty like that, but it will be different. It will actually be an attempt to bring an artificial peace that will somehow involve the reconstruction of the Jewish temple, the tribulational temple of Revelation 11, referred to in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and in the book of Daniel and in the Olivet Discourse by Jesus. I'm quite persuaded there will be a millennial temple. We know the Antichrist will make a covenant with death. Now, when this happens, when it's going to commence, I do not know. But again, the progression of events we are seeing in every sphere is exactly what Jesus said to look out for in the Olivet Discourse. Because of the Israel factor, because the countries in the Bible are at the center of these world events again, because the Jews are back in their land, that makes this time different than the other times when true believers thought it was the last days. Those other times foreshadow the time that we're coming to. Now, Jesus was quite clear. He warned about these things, and he warned about the church being misled. I'm in Argentina at the moment. The first words out of his mouth, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? First words out of his mouth, see to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and mislead many. There are many false Christs being accepted by evangelical Christians as we speak. Our Christ said, I'm not coming back physically except the way I left. If anybody says I have returned physically, don't believe it. But in the Roman Catholic Mass, you see transubstantiation belief of the Blessed Sacrament, where they say Jesus has returned physically, and they worship the bread and wine physically as the return of Christ, the physical presence of Christ. I'm in Argentina at the moment, the Catholic country. People in Great Britain and the United States and Canada and Australia don't see real Roman Catholicism. To see real Roman Catholicism, you have to go to a Catholic country like Argentina or like Ireland or like the Philippines or like Italy. You have to go to a real Catholic country to see real Catholicism. The Eucharistic Christ of Rome is another Christ. We now have Chrislam, people seeking to unite with Islam, thanks to people like Peter Kreeft and those who endorsed his work, like the Reformed theologian J.I. Packer, who endorsed his book Ecumenical Jihad, and the late Chuck Colson. We have to have ecumenical union with Islam to morally redeem society, and Peter Kreeft, the division of Muhammad in heaven, and so forth. Well, the Christ of Islam, the Christ of the Quran, is not the Son of God. They deny it. 1 John tells us that is Antichrist. That was no problem for Chuck Colson, and it's no problem for J.I. Packer. They couldn't care less. They'll go with Peter Kreeft. But what Jesus warned about, false Christs, here they are. You've got Chrislam, you've got ecumenism with the Roman Church, And now you have evangelicals playing footsies with the Mormons, including people who should know better, like Ravi Zacharias, Craig Hazen from Biola University, even Craig Blomberg, a man I used to have a very high regard for as a scholar from Western Baptist Seminary. What's the problem here with the Mormon Jesus? Well, the Book of Mormon says he's the spirit brother of Satan. Many false Christs are here. It continues. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. We're seeing nation against nation, ethnon against ethnon. It is ethnic, it is racial. Kingdom against kingdom is basileia against basileia, or malchut against malchut in Hebrew. But nation against nation is ethnic, ethnon in Greek, goy, nation in Hebrew. When the Messiah comes, it won't happen anymore. As Isaiah wrote, Lo isa goy la goy herev, lo yirmadu od milhama. Nation shall not live sword against nation. Ethnic nation shall not live sword against another ethnic or racial nation. Neither shall they learn war anymore when the Messiah comes. But before he comes, you're going to see ethnic tensions, racial tensions. The United States has become extremely racially polarized under the Obama administration for 8 years. It is more racially polarized now than it has ever been since probably the era of Jim Crow. It is more racially polarized now. There is more racial hatred of an intense nature, to the point of where it's become ridiculous. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which began as a legitimate organization legally fighting the Ku Klux Klan, will call anybody who disagrees with their agenda a racist. They will basically slander people as racist who aren't, simply because you don't agree with their policies, to the point of it being ridiculous.
So this is funny. You ever heard of the Southern Poverty Law Center? They're a hard-left outfit that loves to label people as extremists. Their ever-growing list seems to defame everyone. Ben Carson, he's an extremist. Rand Paul. They called Maajid Nawaz an anti-Muslim extremist. And get this, he's a moderate Muslim battling religious extremism. It makes no sense. There's Ursi Ali, a black feminist who protests against genital mutilation. SPLC placed her name in a guide to anti-Muslim extremists. So that's extreme, being against genital mutilation? I wonder what they'd make of Gandhi. But that's not the funny part. It's the money. This poverty center has loads of it, a $320 million endowment, and chucks almost 20% of it into offshore equities, Cayman Islands stuff. I don't understand it. So this poverty group sits on a pile of offshore dough. That's like a personal trainer with a gut, or a priest with a harem. The center paid out $20 million in salaries in 2015, but provided just $61 grand in legal assistance. So the Southern Poverty Law Center appears to have no poverty and do virtually no law. It's the most misleading name since the Democratic Party. Yes, count it. Worse, their love for calling people haters incites haters into action. The maniac who shot Stephen Scalise liked the Law Center on his Facebook page. And a terrorist who attacked the Family Research Council back in 2012, shooting a security guard, did so after the SPLC labeled them a hate group. He was a fan, too. I don't know, filthy rich, linked to violence. I think the SPLC might end up having to put itself on its own list. Indeed, Jesse. It's a pretty amazing story. I have a theory that no one goes after this group because of the name. You hear Southern Poverty Law Center, you go, oh, they must be a really good outfit, and you don't want to be on their bad side.
That's true, and the media does this because they cover for them. They should actually put a little D next to their name because they're really an activist group. I should get into the charity business.
You should.
I mean, you can fight poverty with parking money offshore. The Clinton Foundation can take millions from the Saudis to fight for women's rights. Al Sharpton can shake you down and then not pay taxes, but then the IRS will go after the Tea Party. That's exactly what happens. I think this place started as with noble intentions.
I think so.
To go after the KKK, and then they morphed into some smear machine, and they pay all these salaries and they raise all this money, do nothing. They have this hate map which links in regular family values conservatives with Klansmen. One guy shoots these people up because he looks at the map, but Palin puts up a map, and the media makes her the bad guy.
Yeah, and it wasn't even a map. It was just a thing with like a little round circle. So, Juan, you're pals with Ben Carson. You know he's a nice guy. He's on the list. He's been on the list. So have like moderate Muslims trying to try to reduce the Islamic extremism in their own religion. Why do they do this? Why do you think SPLC makes it such a blanket hate statement for everybody?
Well, I don't know that it's blanket, but I will say this. I think they provide a public service, but I think it's one that conservatives are very uptight about because they feel that, in fact, they are being labeled as hate groups when they have arguments about, for example, let's say Family Research Council, about attitudes towards transsexuals or gay, whatever. So they say, well, we're just expressing our religious values and views, but the Southern Poverty Law Center says they're hateful views. Or after Charlottesville, you get Apple and Tim Cook millions of dollars pouring into Southern Poverty Law Center, Google.
To use the phrase virtue signaling, once again, I hate doing that.
Right, but I'm just saying, so I think lots of people see them as virtuous and don't get into the finances. So the Weekly Standard has this piece about them having offshore investments, and apparently it was recommended by their investment counselors as a way to protect their assets. Nonetheless, I think what this is about is the right not liking the idea that somebody's labeling them.
But you know what? It's interesting if they don't. They label, somebody's against traditional, they have traditional marriage beliefs and they're against gay marriage, but they don't behead gays or throw them off buildings, but somehow that's missing from their...
No, but the people who do behead gays and throw them off buildings, and the people who don't let women have any civil liberties and kill them for adultery, those people go ahead and shuttle money to the Clinton Foundation, which is completely different. Now, I'm wondering, is this a tax-exempt organization? Are they, in fact, not paying taxes? Is it a 501c3 or a 501c4? Then it's a money laundering operation. So, you know, what they do, and I don't know which came first, the Southern Poverty Law Center or the egg, but it looks like, you know, they looked at the Clinton Foundation and they sort of mirror one another, but the labeling is very, very subjective. And, you know, we're in such a politicized era that unfortunately people who are fans of groups like this, they are so obsessed with confirmation bias that they don't do any sort of investigation where they would be even slightly curious about the other side or curious about an objective observer. So
I don't think the Klan was too incurious. They tried to burn them down.
Well, it doesn't sound like they're doing anything with the Klan. It sounds like if you are poor and in the South, you're much better off getting a job here because they pay a lot more money to massage one another than they do to actually help other people who, according to this raw data. I mean, that's not my opinion. That is the...
No, I think that, I don't know about all the numbers. I don't know how it compares to other nonprofits. But I will say... But I will say that it's very important, I think, that somebody is looking at the growth of these neo-Nazis and white supremacist groups across the country.
Dana, let's look at who they're looking at. Maajid Nawaz. This is a guy that is basically a hero. He's risking his life every day coming out against radical extremists.
He's one of the very few who's willing to come out and
talk
about it.
Puts him on a hate list, basically targeting. This is why people don't like to be labeled, because they're in danger. This guy's already in danger. He's doing more than anybody.
And I don't know about his story in particular, but I do know Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And there are real-world consequences for this type of targeting because she lives with 24/7 security. She has a husband and 2 young children, and she's never able to rest easy because these Muslim extremists are after her.
They murdered her with
her best friend.
Theo Van Gogh on the street.
The other thing is the Weekly Standard asked the ACLU, do you have offshore accounts, and do you... The answer was no. So I think that there is a clear difference there, and nobody would say that the ACLU isn't actually doing the work that they say they are. I do wonder if Elizabeth Warren will ask the Southern Poverty Law Center to bring that money back to the United States. So she asks everybody else to.
Yeah, they've been asking them to repatriate it, absolutely.
I have an offshore account. It's a jar of coins down by the river. I have it on a string.
Think of a black American, an Afro-American liberal feminist. a woman who is a left-center political activist from the extreme left wing, practically, of the Democratic Party. She's a not totally radical, but semi-radical feminist, left-wing, certainly left of center, Afro-American. And she's denounced as an Islamophobe for campaigning against female genital mutilation by fundamentalist Muslims. And the Southern Poverty Law Center attacks her, an Afro-American woman who's a liberal. Or they attack a moderate Muslim who is campaigning against radical Islam. Instead of supporting the moderate Muslim, they attack him as an Islamophobe, even though he's a Muslim. This is the Southern Poverty Law Center. They're driven by race. They're driven by race to the point they'll turn against their own race. They hate Ben Carson. They despise Dr. Ben Carson, the greatest pediatric neurosurgeon of our time, the only brain surgeon successfully capable of separating encephalophageal Siamese twins joined at the head. A brilliant surgeon, brilliant, the greatest of our time, the only man to separate Siamese twins joined at the head, and the babies lived. And they hate him, they denounce him because he doesn't agree with them politically. They'll even call other blacks racist or bigots or Islamophobe. Now notice it's not about race, but race becomes the vehicle. They just yell race, race, race. Or they yell homophobe, or they yell Islamophobe. This is pure Alinskyism. This is what we're seeing happening in the media, left-wing academia, and we're seeing it happening with things like Black Lives Matter, funded by George Soros, who was not black. Why? He does not want Black America to have a responsible leadership. He wants Black America to have a racist leadership because it is part of the agenda to make American blacks part of a permanent underclass to keep the Democratic Party in power. That is my personal view. Nonetheless, it does meet what Scripture says. These ethnic tensions are going to increase. At the same time, wars and rumors of wars increase. At the same time, famines and earthquakes are increasing. But these things are the beginning of birth pangs. Then will come tribulation. Well, when I see people saying there's going to be a pre-tribulational rapture, when Jesus said the diametric opposite, there'll be thalipsis, these things are only the beginning of birth pangs. Then a tribulation is going to come. And he says, the one who endures to the end shall be saved, and the gospel of the kingdom must be preached. He said, at that time, many will fall away and betray one another. Well, that's happening in the church already. You've got people like Hillsong and Tony Campola and Steve Chalk in Great Britain who are betraying other evangelicals who will not acquiesce on things like same-sex marriage. Many false prophets will arise and mislead many. Lawlessness is increased and most people's love will grow cold. The world never loved Jesus Christ. He's warning about the church. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. And then he says, the gospel of the kingdom must be preached. This gospel of the kingdom, we must use these end-time events to present the gospel. People are concerned about the earthquakes in Mexico today. They're concerned about the hurricanes. Interesting, the hurricane in Texas hit Houston. Texas is a right-center, largely Republican voting state, but the area that was hit was the Democratic Party-controlled liberal area of Houston, of the state, which was Houston and its environs. The rest of the state is more conservative. It's Houston that's liberal and Democrat and so forth. And that's the area that got hit. Well, That's not to say we shouldn't pray for and help the people who are there. It's not to say that all the victims are left-wing or whatever by any means. Nonetheless, let's understand this. These things are increasing, and they're increasing in frequency and intensity. Tribulation is coming. Persecution is coming, and it is time to preach the gospel of the kingdom. We need to use these world events, wars and rumors of wars, North Korea, the Middle East, in order to evangelistically engage unsaved people. They all want to know the future, wasting their time going to fortune tellers and astrologers and horoscopes. We know the future. Use prophecy to evangelize unsaved people. The late great Planet Earth was a gross oversimplification of eschatology. If you want to use the term eschatology, it was an oversimplification. But a lot of people were saved through it. The late Barry Smith was a conspiracy theorist, but he was a great evangelist because he used prophecy. There's no magic formula. It's just doing what Jesus said. Use the newspapers, use the internet to evangelize unsaved people, showing how this increase in wars, rumors of wars, natural disasters of seismic proportions, meteorological catastrophes, how the increase in these things is what Jesus said was going to happen, and then point them to the Middle East. What Daniel said about Iran, what Jesus said about Israel. Show them Zechariah chapter 12. We need to capitalize on these things evangelistically. We need to use them to reach the lost while there is still time before a persecution comes when evangelism will become increasingly illegal. Let's move on to this week in prophecy and see how these events are unfolding. In 2015, backed by the United States and the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia began bombing the Houthi rebels who are allied with Ali Abdullah Saleh, who lost power in 2012 in Yemen. The Saudis, armed with the finest of American and British armaments and jet fighter aircraft, have been bombing Yemen intensively. But now they find themselves in a stalemate, unable to win. They find themselves in the kind of situation the Germans, Luftwaffe, found themselves in the Battle of Britain. They find themselves in the kind of situation the Americans found themselves in Vietnam. You can wreak havoc with the Air Force and kill a lot of people. The Saudis have created over 1 million refugees, displaced people in Yemen, and killed thousands and thousands and thousands, many of them innocent. Well, at some point, you're either going to commit ground troops or you're wasting your time. The only way Hitler was going to beat Britain is if he tried to invade England, and that wouldn't have worked. The only way the Americans are going to win in Vietnam is if they went into North Vietnam with ground troops. But they didn't want to do that for political reasons. Well, the Saudi Arabians have themselves in the same kind of stalemate. They do not want a ground war in Yemen. They're probably not that good anyway. They're as good as the American technology supplied to them, but unlike the Israelis, they don't know how to use that technology as effectively as the Israelis do, and probably not as effective as the Jordanians do, or the Egyptians. They're totally reliant on the West to protect them from Iran. This stalemate has begun to tax their economy. They're running a $100 billion annual deficit, which was 15% of their GDP. Now, that may not seem like a lot compared to other countries, but for them it's a lot, given their oil wealth and given their relatively low population of 25 million people. It's a lot. It is a lot. 15% of GDP, massive deficits, and the beneficiary of this is undoubtedly going to be, and already is, Iran. Iran. The Saudis have themselves in an imbroglio in Yemen. and they don't have any way out. Any way out. They cannot bomb their way out. At some point, they're either going to have to commit to a ground invasion, which they're not going to do, or they're going to be just stalemated. Well, this has come to a head this week. The new leadership in Saudi Arabia has basically conceded and is looking for a way out. Only Iran will benefit. And Iran doesn't have to do anything but stand there and watch. Now remember, this area of Yemen and eastern Saudi Arabia, you have a high Shia population, while the House of Saud is Sunni. Everything related to religion is political, and everything related to politics is religious on the Arabian Peninsula. This week in prophecy, Israel has bombed 2 chemical weapons stockpiles in Syria in order to stop them from falling into the hands of Hezbollah. The Iranian game plan, with de facto assistance of Mr. Putin and the Russians, is to replace the ISIS caliphate with an Iranian-controlled Shia equivalent, extending from Lebanon through Syria in alliance with the Alawite Syrian regime of Assad, which is a form of Shia or a sect of Shia, then through northern and central Iraq and southern Iraq, where you have a majority Shia population. A major step in this was the supply of weapons of mass destruction, including chemical weapons, to Hezbollah. We also, this week in prophecy, have seen the Iranians patch up their bad relationship with Hamas in Gaza. Because of the politics of Sunni versus Shia, and because of the Iranian-Saudi divide, Israel was normally facing the threat of Hamas in Gaza at one time, and the threat of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon at another time. Iran is trying to bring about a strategic scenario where it will pull the strings of both Hamas and Hezbollah and be able to hit Israel both from the south and the north simultaneously, forcing Israel to fight a border war on 2 fronts and wear it out economically in the process. They know that when this has happened before and the Israelis have gone into Gaza, it ended in a mess. And when the Israelis went into southern Lebanon, in Shalom LeGalil, it ended in a mess.
The Syrian military says 4 Israeli jets entered Syrian airspace from Lebanese airspace and struck a military site near Palmyra. The Israeli Air Force confirmed the strike, but just said several targets were struck. In response, Syria fired anti-aircraft missiles at the Israeli jets, claiming they downed one and struck another one. The Israeli military says that's, quote, absolutely untrue and that no Israeli jets or civilians were hit by the anti-aircraft fire, but one of those anti-aircraft missiles was taken down by Israel's Arrow missile defense system. That's the first time it's ever been used operationally since it was deployed some 20 years ago. The missile that was struck, that anti-aircraft missile, actually fell in Jordan, and we've seen pictures of that throughout the day. What's unusual about this is, first, that Israel acknowledged the airstrike. Israel very rarely acknowledges reported airstrikes in Syria, though the Prime Minister said sometime last year that they have carried out multiple or dozens of airstrikes in Syria. What's also unusual, and this is important to note, especially from the bigger picture perspective, is the response here, that there was anti-aircraft fire. Since the start of Syria's civil war 6 years ago, that's only happened once before, back in September, and it indicates rising tensions. Normally, Syria didn't even respond when Israel reportedly carried out an airstrike, but we've seen an increase in rhetoric and an increase in response, certainly with anti-aircraft missiles fired. So we'll have to keep an eye on the tension between Israel and Syria. Israel says its red line is advanced weapons shipments to Hezbollah, and they have reportedly carried out numerous strikes on weapons convoys headed to Lebanon.
particularly ended in a mess for the Lebanese Christians sympathetic to Israel, the phalangists of the South. It ended in a mess. Iran knows this. Iran knows Israel does not want to go back into Lebanon. Well, Israel responded this week. Deep inside of Syria, the Israelis took out 2 chemical weapon stockpiles. Allegedly, the actual launch of the aerial bombardment, however, was from Lebanon. In other words, Israeli jets firing ordnance from inside Lebanon was able to hit targets with precision inside of Syria.
Enemy forces are launching a coordinated offensive on our country. Operation Counterstrike will commence in the next few minutes. Our main goal is to destroy a variety of high-value enemy targets. To defeat the threat, all of our platforms must be mobilized. The Spice family, the ultimate precise standoff weapon, is ready for the challenge. Using a variety of accessible imagery and topographical data sources, the missions are easily planned by our squadrons. Mission data is stored onto a memory cartridge and loaded to the weapon. Introducing the Spice 2000 Guidance Kit. The Spice 1000 Guidance Kit. The pilot selects the preloaded mission with its specific defined target, attack direction, and hit angle. To minimize and eliminate aircraft attrition, Spice, with a standoff range of over 60 kilometers, is launched outside of the enemy's surface-to-air defended area. After release, Spice uses its unique scene-matching technology to match the seeker's real-time imagery and to the target's pre-planned reference data in order to identify the target and lock onto it. This advanced capability ensures that Spice overcomes any possible GPS jamming. The scene-matching technology enables pinpoint accurate target hit, and when coupled with high attack angle, it facilitates penetration of hardened targets. The Spice is a combat-proven weapon, and its technologies have already been successfully employed in adverse weather and low cloud base. The attack azimuth and impact angle are defined in order to enable target-specific hit requirements, such as a bunker on a hillside. Here, the hit direction is 180 degrees opposite to the release heading, in order to overcome target concealment. The Spice Seeker combines a dual CCD and IR sensor. The large release zone presented to the pilot makes in-flight operation easy and flexible. The Spice family offers autonomous standoff operation, pinpoint accuracy independent of GPS, day, night, and adverse weather operation, reduced pilot workload, simple mission planning, and affordable kit concept. Spice family, the ultimate precise standoff weapon. Brought to you by Raphael, smart and to the point.
These kinds of weapons, where you're not just dropping bombs, but using smart bombs, launch from F-15s, F-16s, and the newer generation of American aircraft, the F-35 and F-22 possibly, Israel is able to take out these targets from quite a distance. They could even, theoretically, take out these targets by launching the smart bombs over Israeli airspace and take down targets well into Lebanon and Syria. It's going to become quite a situation. Israel has bombed 2 this past week in prophecy. But understand the Iranian game plan. Hamas and Hezbollah acting in concert with each other against Israel, forcing Israel to fight a border war simultaneously on 2 fronts that'll be prolonged. Without doubt, CNN and the BBC will be there. So when Hamas and Hezbollah attack Israeli cities and civilians like Kiryat Shmona or Metula or Sderot, and the Israelis are forced to fire back in self-defense, the BBC and CNN are going to show you, look what these terrible Jews did. Not mentioning the fact that the Muslims are using their own civilians, including children, as human shields, knowing the Israelis will have to do collateral damage in order to protect their own citizens. This is the Islamic plan, and of course they always have a friend in the left-wing media and in left-wing academia. That is what is taking place this week in prophecy. Israel is desperate to prevent this kind of Iranian extension of its empire. ISIS is going. The Americans, as Mr. Trump promised, would obliterate ISIS, and that is happening. They're being dispersed. The question is what's going to replace it. The only alternative would be to get a benevolent dictator who's a Kurd. The only alternative would be to get a benevolent dictator who's a Kurd to take over Iraq. That would be the only way to deal with it. Again, the modern Kurds are the descendants of the ancient Medes. In biblical times, they were friendly to Israel and the Jews, and they're still willing to be friendly to the West today. I've said for some time, the only people you can trust in Iraq, the only people you can trust are the Kurds, not the others. You can do business with them. It is their ancient heritage. I'm not saying they're believers, but the Kurds have suffered so much from Arab Muslims, from Persian Muslims, and from Turkish Muslims that they're more open to the gospel than other peoples in Iraq. They've nothing but a bad deal. Now, there are radical Islamist Kurds, but not that many. This, however, would require a concerted effort, and the Saudi Arabians wouldn't like it. This pandering to Saudi Arabia. We have to understand what's happening this week in prophecy. China and Russia have moved again this week to begin marketing oil priced in yuan. China has bought large quantities of gold and is threatening to enter competition with the dollar with yuan, their money, or RMBs that can be exchanged for gold. Well, my best advice would be to anybody who does business with them, exchange the currency for gold quickly because they'll default on it. If Nixon defaulted on the dollar with the gold, you can bet the Chinese will default on the yuan. No problem. They want to overtake or they want to undermine the dollar as the basis of the world currency reserve. A number of things are preventing this. One of which is China is oil dependent. Russia is not, but China is. The United States now has a leverage where OPEC cannot exercise the power it once did, and neither can Russia because of fracking. They cannot push the prices where they used to be. However, lower oil prices benefit China. They don't benefit Saudi Arabia, Iran, or Russia, but they do benefit China as well as the United States. It's a complicated mess. In order to keep the dollar as the currency reserve, and you have to understand, as long as the dollar is the world currency reserve, the United States government, the Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Treasury can, in effect, write checks. It doesn't have to cash. When that is gone, it would send an economic shockwave from the United States throughout the global economy. To preserve the dollar, the Americans need to do certain things, one of which is to keep the Saudi Arabians on their side and to continue to price oil, Arabian light crude, in petrodollars. In order to keep the Saudi Arabians friendly to America, America is doing two things. One, we will turn our back on human rights abuses inside Saudi Arabia and the fact that you are exporting jihadist Sunni radicalism, building mosques and madrasas that try to establish Sharia law outside of Saudi Arabia. They do it in the United States, in Virginia. They're being allowed to get away with this. Well, at the same time, there's no religious freedom for Christians or Jews or anyone else in Saudi Arabia. They can do what they want, and the American government blinks the eye. Again, as we've warned, the Saudi Arabians carried the Bush family, the Bush dynasty, in their back pocket. Mr. Trump is playing the same game, though not to the same extent. The Clintons, certainly Obama, and above all the Bush dynasty, pandered to Saudi Arabia largely for this reason. That is the first thing they need to do, is to turn a blind eye and let them continue to fund the expansion of Sharia, Islamic law outside of Saudi Arabia. The other thing they need to do is to provide a strategic shield protecting Saudi Arabia from Iran. This is a reason why the United States has not thus far attacked Iran. The Iranian threat to Saudi Arabia keeps Saudi Arabia reliant on the United States. The United States says, okay, we will protect you from Iran, but you must continue to price oil in dollars. People have tried baskets of other currencies, including the euro. Now China is trying in some kind of league with Russia. But without Saudi Arabia, their capacity to do this is extremely hindered. Also, the fact that the United States has driven oil prices down with fracking, which is hurting Mr. Putin and is wreaking havoc in Venezuela, causing economic catastrophe for the Maduro regime established by the late Hugo Chavez, who is in all likelihood now in hell with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro as bosom comrades. This is what was happening this week in prophecy. It is a complicated mess. You cannot separate the economics from the political and strategic. Money talks. Money makes the fallen world go round. This week in prophecy, it was filmed on August 22nd, but it was shown on TV in Iran this past week, apparently. Ali Akbar, director of atomic research for the Iranian government and for their Atomic Energy Commission, their equivalent thereof, admitted on television, that the Iranians poured cement into the funnels of nuclear reactors in order to deceive the West, in order to mislead anybody talking about inspection. And you can't inspect unless you give them 30 days notice, thanks to Mr. Obama and Mr. Kerry. Ali Akbar said it would take Iran exactly 5 days to get a 20% uranium enrichment capacity. 5 days.
Reuters has reported that Iran's atomic chief was quoted by state media as saying on Tuesday that Iran can resume production of highly enriched uranium within 5 days if the nuclear deal it struck with world powers in 2015 is revoked. The deal that Iranian President Hassan Rouhani championed with the United States, Russia, China, and 3 European powers led to the lifting of most sanctions against Tehran in return for curbs on its nuclear program. Rouhani has intensified efforts to protect the deal, also known by its acronym JCPOA, against Washington's return to an aggressive Iran policy after U.S. President Donald Trump approved new sanctions on Tehran.
These people can get weapons-grade uranium, possibly plutonium, in less than a year. And he admitted it. They did it to deceive the West. Again, if there was any president who should have been impeached for acts tantamount to treason, in my opinion and in the opinion of many people, it was Barack Obama. John Kerry. We have seen betrayals of America to the Saudis by the Bush dynasty and the pandering to them by the Clinton dynasty. But nobody has gone as far as Barack Obama, what he did in his illegal treaty, never approved by the Senate, with Iran. They openly admit now they're violating it. They openly admit that it achieved nothing, that they have the capacity to enrich within 5 days to 20%. Courtesy of Barack Obama, who gave them $150 billion in unfrozen funds. In effect, Barack Obama and John Kerry funded radical Islamic terror. That's what it works out to. And there's still people stupid enough to like them, to respect them, to vote for them if they ran in an election again. They vote for their own destruction. This kind of blindness characterized both Israel and Judah before the Assyrian and Babylonian captivity. They pandered to and even imitated those sworn to their destruction. Now the West is doing the same thing, teaching Islam in schools, telling Christian children in California to dress up like Muslims and take Islamic names and say the Islamic confession of faith, which to a Muslim of the Sharia means the child is converted to Islam, just because they said it. And they do this in the name of cultural education. But if somebody tries to read the New Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures, the ACLU will bring a huge lawsuit. This is the judgment of God. This is the insanity that we have reached as a nation. This is the wickedness of the people we've elected. Let's continue. This week in prophecy, clay seals were uncovered by archaeologists in the city of David from the Iron Age. In other words, the first temple period. They were stamped by an iron brand. They were stamped by an iron brand in the first temple period, containing the names of kings of Israel and Judah that we know from the scriptures, and other figures such as Pincus, known in English as Phineas, of King Menachem, and quite possibly of Ahab from the north, speaking of the refugees who came to the south at the time of the Assyrian captivity. Once again, the archaeological record proves categorically that the historical record and the biblical record has historicity.
We're standing here in the City of David National Park, and we're looking at excavations that the Israel Antiquities Authority has been conducting here for the past 4 months. Behind me you can see the destruction layers of 586 BC, the Babylonian destruction of the first temple city of Jerusalem. You can see here we have jars that were smashed in this room and covered over by layers of destruction, of charcoal burnt. And what we've been doing here is exposing this layer in order to understand better the days leading up to and the actual event of the destruction. Traditionally, the area that we're standing in was thought of being sort of outside the city walls. About almost 60 years ago, Kathleen Kenyon exposed parts of what have been understood as the city walls of Jerusalem of the 7th century BCE. So this was sort of thought of as an external area without settlement. And here we've exposed a row of buildings. We're not sure exactly what their function is yet, but that's part of what we're trying to understand, that's outside that line of city wall. And so are we outside the city? Are we excavating an external quarter? Are these domestic buildings? Another interesting thing is that while behind me we have a very, very clear destruction level showing burnt signs, and you can see all the black sort of marks. Those are pieces of charcoal which burnt and collapsed in the room. Buildings dating of the same period just to the south of us in this excavation don't show signs of destruction. So it seems like not all the buildings were destroyed in a single event, but maybe specific buildings were destroyed and other buildings were then abandoned and left.
Hi and welcome to the Jerusalem Watch. My name is Anarina Heyman and I'm standing in the city of David, home to the ancient biblical Jerusalem. And what we see here is literally the Bible coming to life. Written in Isaiah, it says, Hitna ari me'afar kumi, shake off your dust, arise, take your rightful place, O Jerusalem. Standing with me today is Joe Uziel from the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. It must be such a privilege working here on a daily basis, getting a better understanding of the ancient city. Well, it is, Anarina. I've been working in archaeology for over 20 years, but only about 5 years ago did I begin here when the Israel Antiquities Authority offered me the opportunity to take part in uncovering the city's past, and it really has been amazing since, uncovering the day-to-day life of every single period that's been uncovered in Jerusalem over its 4,000 years of history. And you can see it right here behind us in the Givati parking lot excavations of the Israel Antiquities Authority, directed by Doron Ben-Ami and Yana Chekanovich, who excavated all of the layers going down from the later Islamic periods and all the way down to the First Temple period. Particularly outstanding is the Second Temple period, where we find here mikvaot, ritual baths, which were carved into the rock with steps leading down to make sure that Jews were pure when they were in Jerusalem. Because it was Jerusalem, they had to keep the purification laws. Well, yes, that's exactly it. During the Second Temple period, the Jews living in Jerusalem were very, very strict about purification, whether it's the mikvaot, the ritual baths that I mentioned before, or the vessels they were using. Interestingly, the most common thing we find in archaeology is pottery vessels, but pottery vessels become impure with contact with an impure person. And so in the Second Temple period, we find a plethora of stone vessels, because stone does not have impurity passed to it. So even if an impure person holds it, in my hand right now is one stone mug, which was carved out of chalk stone, and you can even see the burn marks here of the layer in which it was exposed in. And these are very, very common in Jerusalem in the Second Temple period, and we even know to the north where they were carved out from, the quarries in which the stone was cut out from in order to make these vessels, and you can see the craftsmanship behind making these. Incredible. You just showed us here that it's burned. This means it was part of the destruction of Jerusalem? Yes, in everywhere that we've been excavating in the city of David, we find a major, major destruction level of 70 CE. Whether it's here, whether it's down at the road, or whether it's in other areas, wherever the city was destroyed and burnt
down, and the vessels which we find within this layer are often marked with the soot marks which were part of the fire.
And also, because of the purity laws, now we know how our forefathers kept kosher in the Holy Jerusalem. There is another place that you have to see. We're going to go a bit more down in the excavations to show you an amazing place. Let's go. I'm standing in a place that played a key part during the pilgrim festivals in the Second Temple period, leading all the way from the Siloam Pool up to Temple Mount. Now it is written in Isaiah, "Clear the road for the people, build up the highway and remove the rocks." This road is being tunneled out. And Joe, I believe not only the road, but amazing things were found during the excavations. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Not only did we discover the amazing road, but also a layer of finds covering the road that originated from the buildings that were alongside the road, which tell us about the day-to-day life in these buildings, which during the Roman destruction of Jerusalem collapsed onto the road. These finds include hundreds of pottery vessels, pieces of stone vessels, just as the one we just saw, archaeobotanical remains which tell us about the grains and the seeds that were being eaten and grown in the area of Jerusalem, and above all that, hundreds and hundreds of coins. Most of these coins are from the 4 years of rebellion of the Jews against the Roman Empire, which were minted here in Jerusalem, and we even have some pieces of molds which were used to make these coins. And these coins were stamped with different things, including Cherut Zion, for the freedom of Zion, and a special one which I'm holding in my hand, which is a silver coin, which on one side has a branch growing 3 pomegranates, and it says on it, Yerushalayim HaKadoshah, Jerusalem the Holy. And if I flip the coin, I have a vessel depicted here, and on this side, it first of all tells me the year. It says Shnat Shalosh, year 3 of the rebellion, because there were 4 years of the rebellion, and each year had its year stamped on the coins. And above that, written in ancient Hebrew, it says Chatzia Shekel, half a shekel.
This is the half shekel coin that they used in the temple for the upkeep of the temple.
Exactly, as mentioned in the book that you're holding.
This is amazing. But you also mentioned a rebellion. What was this coin? Why was this coin printed for a rebellion?
Well, the coins were minted not only as currency, but as zuzim. Zuzim meaning to move, because they were handed from one to another in order to pass the message on of the rebellion, of the fight against Rome.
Joe, this is amazing. I believe that we found more treasures. So we're going to go a little bit up the road and discuss a little bit more of this. Thank you. We are standing now at the end of the road of the final ascent to the temple at the foot of Temple Mount. This is the road that the people traveled during the pilgrimage.
Yes, before we were downhill halfway up the hill of the city of David, and here we're on that same road which led from the Siloam Pool up to the Temple Mount in order for the pilgrims to take part in the ceremonies. But beneath that road, excavations of the Israel Antiquities Authority led by Eli Shukrun cleared the main drainage channel of the city. It was filled with sediment which Eli wet sifted in order to find special finds, and I'm holding some of them right here. One of them is this gold bell. As you can see, has a small ring on top in order to attach it to the high priest's garment when he would take part in the ceremony in the temple on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year.
So we're talking about, as it is written in the Bible, he had to have 71 bells around the hem of his garment.
Exactly. Imagine 71 bells, and if you can hear very closely the shaking, this is an actual bell, so imagine 70 of these shaking, announcing the approach of the high priest.
Joe, that is amazing. I believe that you're holding another seal there, telling us a bit more about what happened inside the daily temple activities.
Well, here we have a seal saying Deka Leah, which is in Aramaic, pure for God. And we don't exactly know what the seal was used for, but because of the mention of purity, it may have been involved in part of the processes going on the Temple Mount, perhaps stamping between the switching of the priest's work. So while one priest exited, the other priest came in and was stamped as being pure for God entering the temple. That's a possibility.
sort of your ticket into Temple Mount, saying that you are pure.
Exactly, like you get your stamp in your hand today when you go to a club.
Now, we spoke about the drainage tunnel, and I believe that there was quite a sad story that happened in the drainage tunnel.
Well, what we excavated in the drainage channel was mostly sediment of backfill, but within that backfill, vessels were found of the Jews who were hiding from the Romans on the eve of the destruction. They went into the drains, they cramped themselves in order to stay alive during the siege and destruction of Jerusalem.
So this is the Roman destruction, but we also saw that you said that there were 2 layers of destruction, one being the Babylonian. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I think we can get a better idea and a more vivid picture if we go to another place.
Let's go. And just to orientate ourselves right now, we are standing on the eastern slope of the city, and we are actually standing inside a house from the First Temple period.
Yeah, we're standing in one of Yigal Shiloh's excavation areas, and Yigal Shiloh was a pioneering archaeologist who excavated many areas in the city of David, and amazingly, he discovered the destruction of the First Temple city, and we're standing in one of the houses covered in destruction during that time.
Joe, but this area also attests to the many battles that enveloped Jerusalem, and you are holding arrowheads that attest to that. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Interestingly, Jerusalem was not destroyed many times. We have 2 major destruction levels in Jerusalem's ancient history. One at the end of the Second Temple period, 70 CE by the Romans. The second by the Babylonians, which began with the siege in 597 and ended in 586 with the destruction of the First Temple. And these destruction layers are really come to life here in this area where we see the houses of First Temple Jerusalem buried in their destruction with the many vessels destroyed and with the weaponry used to both fight to conquer the city and to fight off those trying to conquer. I'm holding in my hand 2 arrowheads discovered in the Babylonian destruction layer.
Now, how do you know that this is Babylonian?
Well, in archaeology, we work with something we call typology, types. Basically, if I use a modern example, if I take a look at a car from today, it will not look the same as a car did 50 years ago. And the same thing is true in archaeology of every type of find that we have, whether it's pottery vessels or weapons such as these arrowheads. So as we can see here, these arrowheads have these 3 prongs. They're not the usual flat leaf shape, and these are typical of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem.
And what is it made from? Because it's got like a greenish, bluish color.
Well, these are made from bronze, and you can see here the hole in which the arrow would have been inserted. Okay, the wooden part of the arrow would have been inserted.
Joe, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure.
We have seen so much of the destruction of Jerusalem today, but the Bible also says, speak tenderly to Jerusalem and tell her that her sad days are over. By joining the Jerusalem Watch, you can join a lot of people all around the world that are not going to help us only to uncover more of her glorious past, but also accompany her to her promised future to become a praise to the earth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
The historical record is proved by the archaeological record, and the biblical record is proven to be historically true. The Jews are the indigenous people of that land. There is even genetic documentation that they've been there at least 2,000 years. If the world continues to tell the lie, it's occupied. An indigenous people is occupying its indigenous homeland. Again, Goebbels, tell a lie often enough, people will think it's true. This was Bertrand Russell. He just kept repeating that lie. The British socialist philosopher, pacifist, and mathematician. Good mathematician. Otherwise, he was a screwball. Noam Chomsky is another one. A left-wing Jew who speaks absolute rubbish about an occupation, ignoring the archaeological and historical realities that are validated by actual finds. How can an indigenous people be an occupying presence? Well, this week they found clay seals that were used on documents that were pressed into the clay by an iron stamp. with the names of actual kings of Israel identified from the Hebrew Scriptures. Archaeology doesn't lie. Noam Chomsky lies. The Arab League lies. The United Nations lies. But archaeology doesn't lie. Let's continue. Inside of Israel this week, more reports are circulating that there will be an indictment of the wife of Benjamin Netanyahu. The evidence is scant. The prosecution is probably politically motivated, much like we see in the United States with Mueller and these people. Remember, Mueller is a swamp rat. It was Mueller who wanted the terms of referencing radical Islam removed from the counterterrorism training manuals of the FBI and so forth. Mueller was not a good person. What he's doing is largely politically motivated. Well, there's an equivalent in Israel. And they're going after Netanyahu because they cannot defeat him democratically. Much the same as they lost the election to Trump, so they're trying legal means to remove him from office or destroy a second-term candidacy. Now, when Barack Obama committed what amounts to illegal acts, who many people would interpret as treason, there was never a special prosecutor. Why was there no special prosecutor to go after Lois Lerner? Why no special prosecutor to go after Loretta Lynch? Why was there no prosecution of his Attorney General, Eric Holder? These are people who did things that warrant indictment, only when it's politically motivated. Justice is not blind. They're peeking. Well, Israel has the same. It is not purely an American phenomenon. The evidence does not warrant a criminal persecution, in my opinion. Nonetheless, it's being pushed for by the Israel self-hating left. Mr. Netanyahu this week gave a televised speech, and he issued a plea to stop teaching Arab children to hate. He spoke of a little girl named Fatih while going to school with her mother and passing a monument commemorating Dalal Mukarbi, who killed 37 people on a bus in a suicide bombing, and there's a monument to this woman. Then the little girl passes a monument honoring Khalid Nazer, who murdered 22 Jewish children. And there's monuments to them. And the United States and the European Union continue to fund this Palestinian Authority who does this and exposes little Arab children to it, teaching it in school that they're martyrs. And we get the bill for it. This must stop. One of the main malefactors is undoubtedly the Islamic Relief Worldwide, IRW. That is aligned with Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. There is the DeSantis Amendment before the Congress looking to block funding. Why are we giving American tax dollars to these organizations that are aligned with and supportive of organizations that are terrorist? This Week in Prophecy. The Council of American Islamic Relations. 3 times its leadership were unindicted co-conspirators, and it was for political reasons they were not indicted, due to the Saudi Arabian links in using charitable fronts for purposes of raising money for terrorist organizations. The Justice Department and FBI stated this publicly. Yet the CAIR was given an outpost in the Jesuit University at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., where there is a school of international affairs, where diplomats are trained by Jesuits or in a Jesuit institution. Aslan Iftikhar, an apologist for radical Islam, was given a position that Georgetown said was anti-Islamophobia. Now, this is an apologist for radicalism. It was at the Prince Arid Ben Talal Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding, a Saudi prince. Well, tell me, tell me, Georgetown University, tell me, you Jesuits, where is the Christian Muslim understanding in Saudi Arabia? He runs the Kingdom Fund, the sovereign wealth fund of the Saudi government. That is who Prince Arid bin Talal Al Saud is. You can't build a church in Saudi Arabia. I've been there. Now, what do you expect from a Jesuit? They're sick degenerates. Look at their history. Look at their role. Look what they did in the time of Ignatius Loyola. But they give it an outpost to a spokesman, an apologist for radical Islam in the name of being anti-Islamophobia. Arsalan Iftikhar should not even be in the United States. His attempt to defend the Charlie Hebdo killings in Paris, not the killings themselves, but he tried to unlink it from Islam. Now, I have no love for Charlie Hebdo. They're left-wing and I don't like them, but they should not have been murdered. There is freedom of press and freedom of speech in Western countries. At least they're supposed to be. But Arsalan Iftikhar said concerning the Hebdo murders by Islamic terrorists, religion should not be brought into it. It placates the terrorists by making it a religious issue. When Islamic terrorists did it in the name of Islam, how can you possibly argue credibly that religion should not be considered a factor in what happened? It's not even logical. But what do you expect from Jesuits? They've tried to defend the Spanish Inquisition. This Week in Prophecy. We turn to Canada. Things have not been going very well in Canada. The leadership contender for the NDP of Canada, the National Democratic Party, is a Sikh of Indian descent. His name is Jagmeet Singh. Now, in India, Sikhs and Muslims are traditional enemies. In the Sikh religion, they carry a dagger, similar to the way the traditional Scottish Highlanders carry a skadoo, a knife in their sock. The Sikhs have an equivalent to fight Muslims. That was their background. But now something has happened in Canada that's quite different. Dr. Nawal El-Sadawi, the women's rights activist in the Muslim world, best known in the West, from Egypt, she's being ignored. She warns what the hijab is. She talks about female genital mutilation, arranged marriages. She's ignored. Mr. Sheen said he wants political solidarity with Canadian Muslims. They're being targeted over the hijab issue. Why is he listening to Western friends of Sharia, Western friends of a rather radical interpretation of Islam? Why is he listening to them instead of listening to Arab women, even moderate Muslim Arab women, who are campaigning for women's rights in the Muslim world? They get ignored, the radicals get embraced. This is Canada. This Week in Prophecy. The largest private sector union in Canada, Unifor, has voted for the anti-Israel BDS position. They ignore the fact that the standard of living of West Bank Arabs has increased 320% under the Israelis. Everything from longevity and mortality, but above all, employment, it's all improved radically under the Israelis compared to what it was. These BDS sanctions are not going to hurt the overall Israeli economy, at least not very much. But they're going to hurt Palestinian Arab labor, their livelihoods and their jobs. We saw the same thing in the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. The blacks became the chief victims. The ones they were trying to help paid the price. I was against apartheid. It was a racist and unjust system. But what's replaced it in South Africa is worse. Black unemployment has more than doubled in South Africa since the end of apartheid. Black underemployment is uncalculable. Infant mortality has risen, longevity has decreased, but unemployment has become unspeakable. Far worse now than it ever was. South Africa replaced one evil with a worse one. What used to be political crime is, political violence is now just crime. Same thing is going to happen in the West Bank if people like Unifor, friends of radical Islam, ever get their way. They would deny they're friends of radical Islam, but when you have a Palestinian Authority building monuments to suicide bombers who murder children, how can you not say they're radical Islamists? Again, they call it occupied territory. Please show me how an indigenous people can occupy the territory. Well, let's look at the Iroquois and Algonquin Indians in Quebec. La Rouge, the Red Ones. Are they occupying Quebec? How can they? They were there before the French came. And the Jews were there before the Arabs came. This week in prophecy. There has been the usual pressure by the American government, now the Trump administration, for Israel to acquiesce. Again, we've explained that Mr. McMaster's is no friend of Israel, and Mr. Mattis is questionable. Most of the conservatives have gone from the Trump administration. There is pressure on Israel once again. Not as bad as it was under Obama, not as bad as it would have been under Hillary, but the embassy has not been moved to Jerusalem. Saudi Arabia's support of radical elements has not been addressed. When the Trump administration this past week began speaking again to the Israelis and to the Palestinian Authority, and the previous week, including his Jewish son-in-law, bad move having him in the government anyway, bad move having McMaster's in the government. In my opinion, Mr. Trump needs to have people like John Bolton and Congressman Allen West in his government running national security and foreign relations. That is my view. Nonetheless, I do pray for Mr. Trump, but I cannot rule out these hurricanes being a judgment. I recall Hurricane Katrina. The pressure put on Israel by the corrupt Bush administration to placate the Saudi Arabians for the sake of oil saw God's judgment on the American oil industry when Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf. The Americans were concerned about the Persian Gulf. They should have been concerned about the Gulf of Mexico, the American oil basin. The refineries are in Louisiana and Texas. Hurricane Katrina hit and had a devastating impact on the oil industry in America. That's where the judgment fell. Now it's happening again. You want to placate Saudi Arabia, you want to placate Muslims. Because of oil, the American oil industry gets hit. The refinery in Houston, the largest in the nation, possibly the world, out of commission. Even though crude prices remain low, pump prices go higher. God is no respecter of persons. Mr. Trump, please stop trying to placate Islam. It's never going to work. I realize you have to protect the dollar. But if you seek God, he'll show you a better way to do it. I cannot say that these hurricanes are not divine judgments, or at least warnings. And they're affecting the oil industry. A hurricane could have just as easily slammed into Florida, or Georgia, or the Carolinas with equal impact. But it hit where the oil was. Quite a thing. North Korea, you can't rely on Russia or China. Mr. Putin will never support sanctions against North Korea because there's sanctions against Russia from his own adventurism against the Ukrainians, among other reasons. China has helped North Korea develop those weapons. You've got to do what you said you were going to do, Mr. Trump. Put an embargo on China and only lift it when they act against North Korea. Put the embargo there immediately. That is my opinion. That is what I think he needs to do. Again, I do not present this as a scriptural opinion or as a theological opinion. It's purely a personal opinion. But looking at these world events in light of prophecy, I understand what's happening. And we can understand from Scripture why it's happening. We need to pray for Mr. Trump urgently. There's something to these hurricanes. And there's something to what's happening in North Korea. And he's failing to keep the promises he made on a variety of issues. Now, it's not only his fault. Remember, he had to run not only against the Democrats, he had to run against the establishment Republicans. People like Mitch McConnell and Ryan, Mr. Boehner, senators like McCain and Flake and Murkowski and Collins and Corker, the Republican Party establishment. These are Democrats who sit on the opposite side of the aisle. They are blocking the actions of any conservative or libertarian faction that Mr. Trump aligns himself with in the pursuit of his agenda. It is not exclusively his fault. We need to pray for him and for Mr. Pence. Remember, the people like McConnell and Ryan, they're as bad as Pelosi and as Schumer. But today we see something that happened this week in prophecy. Mr. Trump met with Charles Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and sided with them against Ryan and against McConnell, saying, I'll make a deal with the Democrats if you don't work with me. He's playing a high-stakes game. I hope for the good of the country he's as clever a negotiator as he says he is. But it's a very unfortunate situation, a desperate situation. Remember, nations get the leaders they deserve. We need to pray for Mr. Trump and pray for him urgently. We need to pray against this madman in North Korea. And we need to pray that our government and Congress will stop funding radical Islam. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Shalom, shalom, Yerushalayim. Those who love her will prosper. The Lord will bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. And God's judgment will come on anybody who persecutes the true church. This week in prophecy, the Chinese government has made it illegal even for the state churches to bring children to church and to teach them Christian principles. Even the state churches aligned with the government, that the government allows, that have compromised with the party agenda and its corruption. Of course, for the house churches, where most of the true believers are, they're already illegal. But the human rights abuses in China, why is this not a factor in American and British and Western and Australian foreign policy? Why are the rights of Christians who are being persecuted in Muslim countries, like Saudi Arabia, why is that not a factor that is addressed in foreign policy? Why? Read Matthew 24, that's why. Well, that has been this week in prophecy. Things are coming together along the lines that Jesus said they would. Praise God, He is coming soon. This is Jacob Prasch coming to you this week from Buenos Aires, Argentina. Thank you so much for listening. God bless. Please keep Israel and please keep the Trump administration in prayer. Esto es Jacobo Prasch aquí en Buenos Aires, Argentina. Demos gracias al Señor. Vaya con Dios, con bendigo. Bye.